Hey, what's up guys? Paul Radiker here. Some of you may know this, but a while back I actually switched from Canon cameras to Sony cameras. Specifically from the Canon EOS 90D to the Sony a6600. Now there are a lot of reasons why I did this, and I thought I would go over some of these in case some of you guys are also thinking of switching. Now I think the number one reason for me has to be that the Sony cameras have IBIS, or in-body image stabilization. So that means that even if your lens does not support stabilization, the camera body does it itself. So like the sensor kind of moves itself within the camera body to keep the image stabilized. So while you're holding the camera for video, even if the lens doesn't support its own stabilization, the camera body is still making it at least kind of stable. Now it's not perfect. I mean, it's not like an electronic gimbal. You're still going to have some shakiness, but it's better than having no stabilization at all. I think for me that was a pretty big thing, because my favorite lens that I'm using right now, actually, the Sigma 18-35 f1.8, that lens does not have any stabilization in it. So when I was shooting videos with my Canon 90D with this lens, it did kind of seem a little shaky at times. Now I know it's not really a telephoto, so it doesn't zoom in very far, so it doesn't get like really shaky, but it was kind of noticeable. Like, it wasn't very stable, and when I shoot videos with that lens attached to my a6600, it actually looks a lot better. Like, it's more stable, not perfect, but it is better than having no stabilization at all. Now another one is that on Sony cameras, you definitely get a lot more customization. What I mean by that is that there are custom buttons you can map. Pretty much all of the color settings you can make however you want it to be. There's a lot you can do with the Sony camera. On Canon cameras, there's not a lot you can do, actually. You can change the colors a little bit, and you get some adjustments you can make, but it's not nearly as in depth as the color settings you get on a Sony camera. I'm one of those guys that does like to mess around with the colors a lot when filming, so for me that was also another big one, the fact that I can make the colors however I want them to look. Now I know you can also color grade, that is a thing as well, but it's kind of nice that just out of the camera, you don't have the color grade after the fact. You can have the colors how you want them to look straight out of the camera. Another thing is that you get log color profiles straight out of the box. Now I know some Canon cameras do let you do log, but a lot of the APS-C cameras, which are the ones that I used, did not actually have that option. So like the 90D that I had didn't have any way to shoot with log format. So if I want to do any color grading, I could technically use the Technicolor, I think it's called Cinestyle, I'm pretty sure that's it. I could use that, and that's, it's a really flat color profile. It works, but there's not a lot of flexibility with the colors when you use that. It's not quite as good as a log format, so yeah, you can get close to it with Canon, but it's still not log. With the Sony camera, you get S-Log right out of the box, and it's fantastic. Also, Sony cameras are just lighter, and they're smaller. It's a lot easier to mount a Sony camera onto an electronic gimbal, especially if you have a cheaper gimbal that doesn't allow as much weight. Because Sony mirrorless cameras tend to be lighter than a Canon DSLR, of course, it's going to be easier to put on a gimbal because gimbal can only hold so much weight until they just, don't work anymore. And because Canon cameras tend to be a bit heavier and bigger, it's just easier to fit a Sony mirrorless camera on there. Another thing is that Sony cameras actually shoot video in 6K, and then it downsamples it to 4K, and that's actually one reason why Sony video footage tends to look so much sharper than Canon's. It's because it's actually shooting at a very high resolution, and then it basically just scales it down to 4K. And I mean, there's some science behind that, but basically it's going to make it look sharper. And with Canon cameras, what it tends to do is that it just shoots it in 4K. So it's not shooting 6K and then downsampling, it's just 4K. So it's not quite as sharp as what you get out of a Sony. Now this one probably isn't going to affect you too much if you only shoot video, but I know for me, since I also do photo work as well, the electronic viewfinder is really nice. I know a lot of people do kind of like the traditional DSLR viewfinder that's optical, since there's no LCD display, that you don't have to use battery or anything, so it's more efficient. But I just tend to like the electronic viewfinder because what you see through that viewfinder is what the picture is going to look like. My problem with the traditional DSLR viewfinders is just that what you see through that viewfinder isn't always what you're actually going to see in the photo, because it's not accounting for like the ISO settings you have set, or the aperture even. Like, you're not going to get to see the depth of field unless you hold down the depth of field preview button, but who uses that anymore? It's just not going to be representative of what you're going to see when you take that photo. Now we're going to get into some just minor things that like doesn't change things a lot, but I kind of appreciate them. So you get focus peaking on Sony cameras, which is nice. So, if you turn it to manual focus, there is a way for it to show like little lines around the objects that are in focus on the camera screen. So that does help if you're trying to focus on a specific object while filming or taking photos or whatever. I personally love this. I use it all the time because I do shoot a lot of stuff in manual focus. And so this allows me to move the focus ring until I start seeing a little outline around the object that I'm trying to focus on. And so that would tell me right away that this is in focus without really having to zoom in on it, or view it on a bigger monitor or something like that. I just know by seeing that outline that the object is in focus. Another really small thing is that you can change the options on the camera monitor without actually affecting the HDMI output to your monitor. This is really big if you like to stream with your camera. So like, if you're using your camera as a face cam, or if you use it for like Zoom calls or whatever, it's nice that you can go into your camera's menus and change options and stuff without those options appearing to the people who see your camera stream. I do actually use my camera for Zoom calls and stuff like that. Like if I have a video conference or something, I use my camera as my face cam. So it's nice that like if I forget to change something before the meeting or something, I can go into the settings of my camera and they still see my face. Like my face still appears, but I'm in the menus on my camera monitor. It's just that they don't see it on the output. On Canon cameras, it doesn't do that. It actually shows them the menu through HDMI. And on top of that, you don't even get to see it on the monitor. You have to rely on the HDMI feed to be able to see your menus. And I never like that too much. So I do like how Sony does it, where the video feed is still being outputted via HDMI, but then you see the menu on your camera screen. Now, another really big one that I actually forgot to mention is that Sony cameras actually have really good autofocus systems now. It used to be pretty bad. Like, I would say that Canon's used to be king over like all of them. But I have noticed that Sony, with their recent autofocus, has actually gotten a lot better. Especially with the a6600, they have introduced some new technologies for autofocus that I actually think looks... I mean, I wouldn't say it works better than Canon. I feel like in some ways Canon's actually is better. But I don't know. I'm not noticing too much of a difference anymore. They both seem to do pretty well. I haven't really noticed that the autofocus and the Sony has done worse than I did with my Canon. So I would say that these days, that both Sony cameras and Canon cameras do about just as well with autofocus. I do like how with Sony you can change the speed at which it changes the focus as something moves back and forth. So as something moves toward the lens, you can change the drive speed. So like it might change the focus a bit slower, maybe to make it more cinematic, or make it easier on the person's eyes or something like that. With Canon, it typically just does it really fast, and you can't change the speed of that. So you can't really change the look of how the focus changes on the Canon, but you can on the Sony. So, little nitpick things here and there, but I do appreciate those features on the Sony camera. Now, here are some of the things that Canon does do better than Sony, in my opinion. I'd say the number one thing is the color science. I do kind of miss how the colors looked on the Canon. Now, I did do the best that I could to make the colors on this look just like they do on the Canon. I gotta give Canon props for that. Their color science on their cameras it's just fantastic. So, that is one thing that I think Canon does better. However, you don't get as much customization with those colors, so if you don't like the colors on Canon too much, then you're kind of stuck with the colors on Canon. You can't do too much with them. So that is one thing. A lot of people love the colors on Canon, but if you don't love them, it sucks. You can't do much. So there's that. Now, with Canon cameras, you do get cheaper lens options because Canon DSLRs have been around for so long and the EF and EFS mounts have been around for so long. You get a lot of cheap options for lenses. So if you're looking for if you're not looking for the best look, but you just want to have, you know, maybe you're an ultra wide angle or something like that, you can find a lot of older lenses that go for real cheap. With Sony cameras, because it's a newer technology, it's mirrorless. You can get adapters that you can use old Canon lenses, but those tend to be like, you know, maybe $200 or more. They don't always work the best. Like I know the autofocus on this Sigma lens is slightly slower than it was on my Canon. So it's not going to be the best experience because it's not native. But yeah, with Canon, you can get a native experience with many more cheap lenses. So if you're on a budget, Canon might actually be the better option for you because you're going to get a lot of lenses you can get for cheap. Another thing about Canon is that it does have the fully articulating screen. So, you know, that means you can flip it out and then rotate it however you want. So it's not as limited as the flip out screen that Sony cameras have. I do know that there are Sony full frame mirrorless cameras that have the fully articulating screen, but I'm mostly talking about the Sony APS-C mirrorless cameras just because that's kind of what I stick with. So I gotta give props to Canon. They have a pretty good screen on their cameras. So those are just some of my thoughts on the matter. I know that a lot of people do prefer Canon, and I'm not saying that Canon's bad in any way. I still do love Canon. But I'm just saying that for me personally, like for my uses, I think that Sony was just a better option to go with. I've been using Canon cameras since I first started photography a long time ago. So, you know, Canon's always going to hold a special place in my heart. But I started to look into Sony cameras and I quickly realized this is definitely just the better option for me. You know, just for my uses, Sony's better. But that doesn't mean that Canon's bad. So, you know, if you're looking into whether you want to get a Sony camera or a Canon camera, you know, I would just weigh your options, see what works best for you. You know, compare the specs, look at everything that they can do. You know, think about what you're going to be using the camera for, and then base your decision on that. Because when it really comes down to it, the camera that's best for you is the one that's going to work best for your personal situation. Because everyone's going to be using cameras differently. Because, you know, cameras can do a lot of different things. You know, some people are shooting just portrait photos with them. Some people shoot landscaping photos, or, you know, you're shooting like action videos, you know, things like that. There's a lot of different things you can do. But yeah, those are my thoughts on this. I have been Paul Radiker, and I will see you guys in the next video.